Welcome to Still Unbelievable, a podcast by Reason Press, where we examine religious claims, especially those made by Christians, and we regularly respond to items that are featured on the podcast Unbelievable. We embrace dialogue, but as sceptical former believers, we will also criticise unfounded claims and unsupported beliefs. Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. A few episodes ago, we answered Braxton Hunters 2021 10 questions for atheists, and we responded to those. The first time Braxton did this, which was a year ago or thereabouts, we took our sweet time doing it. It was several months before we did it, and we put that out earlier this year. Now, the 2021 questions, we were much more on our toes, and we got them out within a couple of weeks of Braxton releasing his questions. And so he responded to our videos. Braxton, up on his YouTube channel, has got an hour and 11-minute video responding to our answer to just one of his questions. But they talk around various things, and there's some live chat on it. So what we're going to do is we're going to play through the video, but we're not going to play through all 1 hour and 11 minutes. There's lots that's not relevant. And Braxton plays through lots of our answer to his question. So you don't want to hear us playing in this episode, Braxton playing in his episode, our answers in our episode. It will just create way too much of a double mirror effect, and you don't want that, we don't want that. So we'll zip through that. I'll work out a way of sorting all that out in the edit. But for your listeners, for your purposes, Andrew and I will be playing this video through, and then we'll stop at key points and then record what it is that Braxton says and address that, and then move on. During the video, because it was a live stream, there were comments that came up from listeners which get put up on the screen, and some of those comments and questions from listeners are also interesting and points that we want to respond to, so we'll be doing that as well. So we'll zip through that. But there's also two really important bits right at the very beginning. Braxton pays us, Andrew and myself, a compliment, and I want to acknowledge that compliment, and I want to play that compliment because I'm modest like that. But I want to, before we get to that, I want to say straightforward and straight out, thank you, Braxton, for the compliment. I genuinely appreciated the compliment that he paid us. I didn't ask for it. He didn't have to say it. It was unprompted. Well, it was unprompted from us. Braxton said what he wanted to say, and I want to acknowledge it because it was genuinely nice, and I feel it as a genuine compliment. And I want to say thank you. And I want to say also that Braxton was nicer about us than I think we were about him. And I want to also acknowledge that. I hope nobody thought that we were being belittling of Braxton in our previous episode. I haven't re-listened to it to see if there was. But if anyone thinks that we were, I want to apologise for that. And I think also the key point I want to make about this, and I am going to play the compliment, what Braxton has done is he has shown that being graceful actually changes how people respond to you. And I want to be nicer in this video because Braxton was nice about us. And I want to acknowledge that Braxton went out of his way to say something nice and to be genuinely complimentary about us. And that in return has made me want to be nicer back to him. I want to extend the same grace back to him. We can do this. Braxton has given that as an example, and I want to say we can be like that. One of my favourite podcasts, one of the people who we've had on this podcast a few times, Dave the Graceful Atheist, he absolutely pushes forward this thing about secular grace, about being graceful to people, and Braxton has done the same to us. So I want to acknowledge and thank that and say, let's try and engage in that spirit of grace and go forward that way. I do know, and I am very much aware that some of the episodes and some of the comments that Andrew and I have put out of some of my episodes have been scratchy and have been spiky. I admit and I acknowledge that I can be very much as a character very spiky, not necessarily always on episodes of the podcast, but certainly in my social media feed I can be very spiky. I admit that and I accept that. But this time I want to try to be different. If you think I've failed to be different, if you think I've failed to extend Braxton the same grace that he extended us, please let us know, reasonpress@gmail.com, and I will respond accordingly. So that's how I want to get on with that. And then the other thing I wanted to pick up was Braxton goes slightly off tangent in the tail end of his episode where he talks about people who leave the faith, and he makes a comment about it. He thinks it's harder for people who've left the faith to come back to it. And I want to address that because I think he's very right about that. But I don't want to talk too much about that now. I want to respond to his response first, and then we'll get to that bit at the end. So that's my very long introduction to this video. Is there anything you want to say, Andrew, before we get straight into it?
No, I don't think so. I think, well, I will say one thing by way of invitation. One of the things that you and I have talked about off mic is that we would like for this series, which has gone longer, I think, than any set of responses between Christians and atheists that I know of, right? The fact that he responded to us and now we're responding to him. This is relatively unusual. He offered a video, we responded, he responded to us, we're responding to him. So this is now the fourth return. And I think that we would like to have Braxton on. Hope you guys will hear this and agree. We are genuinely interested in continuing the conversation, though I think there is an issue, and that issue doesn't have to do with our worldviews. It has to do with the fact that we responded to your original 10 questions, and it was lengthy. And our response was lengthy, and you replied to that, and we're only able to pick out one of our responses, which lasted an hour and 11 minutes and 9 seconds. We're about to respond to you, and it may take more than one episode to get that in. And so in order to iron out some of these grounds, if we're going to continue this, it seems like we ought to come together on one call, whether it's Skype or Zoom or whatever it is, and have a good conversation or a series of conversations.
Yeah, that would be cool, actually. On with the video. So we're going to go straight with Braxton's introduction. The lengthy bits that we're not interested in, we'll work out a way of cutting. Here we go.
Braxton Hunter, and he is
Jonathan Pritchett.
So we're glad that you all are here. This is an interesting episode because, to my knowledge, Jonathan, we have not responded to podcasts. Maybe once a long time ago, but when we were doing the Wyma series, but we just respond to YouTube channels, and we've done articles, blog articles, things like that. So I recently did 10 Questions for Atheists in 2021. There's still people making video responses to 10 Questions for Atheists that was from last year, but now there are some people responding to this one. And, last time we did it week by week, and we did it, some of them as live streams like this, and some of them were just me going through, and we would take each week and look at a different questions that I asked and how like 5 or 6 atheists responded. Those are all on a playlist on our channel that you can go check out. Let's jump into this. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to a not as attractive of a screen. And I'm not going to play their entire response. Primarily, I wanted to, in this video, just respond to my question number 2, which has to do with the question of whether there is anything that the particular atheist responding considers to be good evidence for God that Christian apologists or philosophers might bring. And I thought I'm
just going to pause there because I don't think Braxton reads out his whole question. So I'm going to stop and read out the entirety of Braxton's question because I think that's helpful because it helps to set the scene. Question number 2. This is question number 2 from Braxton. So the question is there anything that Christian apologists or philosophers bring that you actually do consider would be good evidence for God? And if not, how do you define evidence? And then my answer basically started off with arguments, not evidence. That's a mantra that you've heard me say quite a lot on various episodes here. I'm just reading back in his question. His question doesn't actually say arguments in it. It just talks about evidence. But I guess from the fact that he mentions apologists and philosophers, I straight went to the arguments on there. Anyway, so that's the full question. Is there anything that Christian apologists or philosophers bring that you actually do consider would be good evidence for God? And if not, how do you define evidence?
I don't know of anything that Christian apologists have brought as evidence for God that I think was good evidence. We're going to get into this in the show, right? But I'll just answer again. And in fact, this part of this has to do with a word that is going to come up from time to time in this video. The word is transcendental. And transcendental means having to do with a non-physical or spiritual realm. So I will say, what would the characteristics of a non-physical, non-temporal realm be? So I'd like to ask that now, right up front. What do you mean by transcendental? And what are the properties of the transcendental realm that will come up in this video? What do you mean by transcendental, and how do you know it?
You brought up some interesting things. By the way, the podcast is Still Unbelievable, as I think a response to Unbelievable the Podcast, which is a Christian podcast. This is Still Unbelievable, and these guys are super nice. I know I say, hey, I really like this guy. That was one of the things from last week that we saw. Tell me you watch Trinity Radio without telling me you watch Trinity Radio was me saying, I really like this guy. He seems like a nice guy. I could be his friend. With these guys, that is absolutely true. They were super cool.
You could be anyone's friend. It's whether or not they'd be your friend. That's typically how this works.
I guess that's true. Yeah. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump in.
So just jumping in there quickly. So there you go. We are super cool, but I'm sure he must have only listened to me and not you, Andrew.
Well, he did have something to say about me. He said the screen was not very attractive. So.
Yeah, but he did. I'm gonna jump in and defend Braxton there. I think he's basically talking about the brute fact that it's a screen with text on it rather than a photo of one of us. Yeah, no, that doesn't work. Yeah, I think that the text would definitely be the more attractive screen.
Yes, I have a face made for podcasting.
Maybe that's why we don't have a YouTube video. YouTube. Well, actually, quick aside on that. There is a Reason Press YouTube channel. There's currently nothing there. So if you're already rushing there to try and find it, you might find it. There won't be anything to see. We are going to do something about that. I'm going to do something about that. One of the problems is the PC that I've got, notice it's a PC under my desk, is 10 years old. I need to do some upgrades to it, to the processor and to the memory. It's just not even worth me attempting to do any video editing on this PC. It's not going to end well, so I may as well not even bother. And so that's mostly why I haven't done any YouTube. Yes, I could upload our podcasts to the YouTube and just have a picture there, and I do know I'll get some listens to that. I just haven't worked out how I feel about doing that and what else I want to do about video editing, so I've just not progressed that. But something will happen about the YouTube channel at some point. I'm hoping it will be next year, 2022. We'll just have to see. But anyway, with that said, let's get back onto Braxton saying how wonderful we are.
Okay, let's stop right there. And Pritchett, I have things that I want to say about this. I could just go right into that. Okay, so first of all, I love, have you still got Rasmussen's book you can hold up there? Most people that are in this realm, interested in the things we're interested in, that's the book, God to Lead, Can Reason How, by Josh Rasmussen, How Reason Can Lead to God. And what that book, what he uses repeatedly as a theme throughout, or a image for what we're doing throughout that book, is a bridge. And he's saying, like, as we're reasoning, we're constructing a bridge. If you took what these guys are saying all the way, then not only would it be self-referentially incoherent for themselves, because what experiment demonstrates for sure that science is the way to get to knowledge, the only way to get to knowledge, which I don't think they would say that. I think these guys would not necessarily say that. But almost everything they say in this department seems to require that.
They may not want to say it, but that's what it ultimately leads to, because they said arguments can't get you anywhere unless they're strictly dealing with the natural world. Mm-hmm. And then went further and said...
Right, I'm going to stop at that point. That's not actually what I said. I don't think you said that either, did you?
Well, so I understand where I sort of did. I don't have a problem clearing up what I meant, but let me let you go first, because I have some notes here, and this is going to take a few paragraphs back and forth between us to unpack. So let me let you go first, And then I don't mind saying exactly what I mean by natural in science.
Yeah, well, I want to go back further, actually, and go back to the question, because the question was, what can Christian apologists and philosophers bring that I count as evidence? And the answer was, well, they bring arguments, and I don't count arguments as evidence. That was the answer to the question. I didn't talk about what of those two things I accept and don't accept. I never at one point said, that's only an argument, it's not evidence, I could never accept it. I didn't say that. I answered the question, what do a Christian apologists and philosophers bring that I count as evidence? And I said, no, they don't bring things that I count as evidence. They bring arguments, and I don't count arguments as evidence. I didn't say that they couldn't convince me. And I didn't say that they never use evidence as part of their arguments. I just answered the question. Arguments are not evidence. So I think there's a danger here in taking that and going forwards. And right in front of me on the comments, we're at 9 minutes 43 in, and there's a comment here from somebody saying, nice to know I can ignore all arguments atheists give out of hand. Well, if that's a response to my answer to the question, then they've completely misunderstood my answer to the question. I didn't say arguments, therefore I can dismiss it out of hand. I didn't actually say that. I didn't say just because it's not evidence, I'm not going to accept it. It's perfectly possible for somebody to convince me of something using just an argument. I just answered the question, arguments are not evidence. So be careful in how far you interpret what it is that I say. Don't hear from me something that I didn't say.
Sure, I agree with all of that, and this idea, well, I can just ignore all arguments that atheists give. Well, that's not actually what was said, and whoever that commenter was, I will just go ahead and say is flatly dishonest. That was flatly dishonest. And if you're listening, whoever you were, you need to do better. And here's why I say you're being dishonest. If I told you that you could depend on arguments to lead you to some conclusion, and so let's say I said, there is no God, and the way that I can prove to you that there is no God is because there's no such thing as something that is all powerful. And we left it there. And I said, that's my argument. And then you would rightly say, but I can't ignore that argument because you don't have any evidence to back it. Well, you should say that. And you should ignore arguments that don't have evidence to back them. But when you say that you can ignore arguments from atheists, what I take that was actually being said was you can just ignore atheists.
Mm.
And that is the kind of popping off that I see all too often. Now, I want to talk for a moment about whether arguments can be evidence and what I see as the problem for saying that arguments can be evidence. So let me offer two syllogisms and ask you, Matthew, which one of these is true? These arguments are perfectly contradictory. I deliberately set them up to be perfectly contradictory. And I want to know which argument you would choose. So here are the arguments. All Whipples are wogs. Gingy is a Whipple. Therefore, Gingy is a wog. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
That's the affirmative argument. Here's the negative argument. No Whipples are wogs. Gingy is a Whipple. Therefore, Gingy cannot be a wog. Those are two arguments. They are perfectly well formed. They lead to a deductive conclusion. The arguments are perfectly contradictory. Transcendentally, which one is true?
I don't know.
And
You're going to make me cry now.
and neither do they. This is why arguments are not evidence in the sense that I was talking about. Now, later on, somewhere around the 23 or 24-minute mark, Braxton and his co-hosts get to a point where they acknowledge that deductive reasoning requires sound argumentation and a demonstration of the conclusion. We're going to talk about this a lot more. But if you think that arguments are evidence and you have no way to back your conclusion, then you glimpse the problem. If you tell me that there's something outside of nature, you need a way to demonstrate that. And as far as I can tell, humans are natural beings. We only have access to those things that are natural. This has been the dualist problem from the beginning of time. Make no mistake about it.
There was a suggestion there, or a desire for clarification on what we would affirm in terms of the relationship between science and knowledge. I know they didn't use necessarily those specific words, but that felt like that was where they were going. So in amongst all the flowery philosophical language, there's probably something, there's a nugget of honesty that's required somewhere in terms of what is our position in terms of how do we identify reality or not, and what claims about reality do we accept, and does it have to, under all circumstances, fall under the umbrella of science, or are there other areas around that we would also accept? And to answer that for myself, yeah, I'm pretty much close to the whole, the scientific method works, and I affirm that as the scientific method is, as it stands at this moment in time, our single best, most reliable way of finding out about things to any reasonable degree. Yeah, that is how we know about black holes. That is how we send spacecraft outside of our solar system. That is how we find out about how viruses work. That is how we come up with vaccines. That is how we split atoms, and all these kinds of things.
And it's also how we know counterfactuals, right? It's how we know the Earth is not flat, right? It's how we know counterfactuals as well. Sorry,
yes, you're absolutely right, and that is a point worth making. But I don't go as far as saying it is only and forever the only way in which we can know things. I accept that there is the possibility that there might be another way of knowing, but that other way of knowing needs to demonstrate itself as being equal or better than the existing scientific method. And if it hasn't met that standard of being able to meet and match and better the scientific method, then under what circumstances should I ever take it seriously? And I propose not. If we want to know how to build a better television or a better mobile phone, we've got a way of doing it, and that falls under the umbrella of the scientific method. We try something, we come up with a new technology, we build a prototype, we test it. Does it work better? No, it doesn't. So we try again and come up with a different method, and then go, okay, that does work better, we'll use that. We don't do it using just philosophy. We do it using scientific methods to underpin all of the claims with facts. And that's where I want to get on that. So in terms of what you were saying before, Andrew, about things outside the universe, about the metaphysical, about God, is any of that knowledge on firmer foundation than the knowledge about how a mobile phone screen works? No, it's not, because it hasn't got the scientific method behind it. So why should I take it seriously? I don't know, therefore I won't.
Let's say I make a counterclaim about the Christian God. This is pretty well known example in philosophical circles, that the notion of the Orthodox Christian God, the all good God that's all powerful and all loving and all present, and all of that sort of thing, the notion that God exists can be flipped on its head. We can ask the counterfactual: is there actually an all evil God who has the same traits, who's just toying with us for its own hidden purposes.
Back to where they were, because I stopped them partway through talking about and speculating over what our position might be. Hopefully what we've said helps with that.
Insofar as even if you have a formally valid argument, the definitions have to be correct, even if your argument is formally valid.
Right.
And so if you're going the latter is, of course, just true and adds nothing to what they're trying to say. But the former part about the natural world having to be the only thing that's available for us to verify is a presupposition, and it can't be underwritten by the very thing that it's purporting to affirm.
Right. And that's what Mad Robot here says. What experiment proves the axioms that all of science is built off of?
This is a common misunderstanding, that there should be one experiment that demonstrates that all of science is true. This is a misunderstanding of materialism. It's a kind of Sunday school misunderstanding. So let me point out, like I did in the last episode, actually, we have units of measure. I'll use them because they're simple and we all know them. We have measurements of length, measurements of time, measurements of mass, measurements of chemical quantities, measurements of voltage, that kind of thing. We measure physical quantities. And if I came to you, Matthew, and I said, hey, I have just discovered a single experiment that unifies all of those physical quantities and demonstrates them all in one experiment, you'd think I was off my rocker. Because we actually don't expect that one experiment demonstrates a conclusion about every kind of question that we can ask. If I told you that the discovery of planet X, if there is one, was also the cure to cancer, you would shake your head and wonder what I was on about, and you should. So this question about what one experiment demonstrates the truth of science is the kind of question that I don't think has been carefully thought about.
I'd go actually further, and my answer to questions like that is, well, every science experiment ever done, frankly, because science has done billions of experiments over the decades, and they all show that testing something is a good way of finding out whether you're right or not.
You can just insist doxastically that you have a belief, and because you hold the belief, you must be right. If you have the right notion of God, how are you going to get me there? If I have the right notion of trigonometry, why measuring the motion of Mercury was difficult? I can show you how and why. So if we can get to that level of conversation about God, then let's just get there. Let's cut the preliminaries. Let's put down the mic and let's get to that.
Yeah. I want to know that God exists. If God exists, then I need to know a way to know about it that is reliable and confirmable. I don't want it just because I want it to be true. Well, actually, that's not necessarily my position, that I want it to be true. But I don't want to believe in God just because that suits me. And I don't want to believe in God just because somebody comes up with a fancy argument that convinces me. I actually want to be able to prove it, to validate it, to question it, and be shown to be wrong in my current opinion.
Right, and conclusively against competing hypotheses, right? I want to be able to say that there is a Christian God and that there absolutely cannot be an Islamic God.
Maybe I am, but I certainly don't mean to. And what I can tell you is that in the podcast episode, they did say, well, that's what science does. It does blah, blah, blah. So it seems like they're treating science as the only way to knowledge.
Let me just stop there because we've just said that's not what we're doing. Okay, it is just to repeat what I've already said, it is the single current best way of knowledge because it has worked over the past 150 or more years. The Bible doesn't give us mobile phones or rockets to Jupiter, but science does. If you have a way of getting knowledge that beats the scientific method, bring it on, let's test them against each other and see which one is better.
Sure. And just to say again, where I said science here, I tend to say science in regard to the scientific method. I tend to say science in regard to a placeholder for science, technology, engineering, and math, right? So I tend to use that word possibly much more loosely than I should. And maybe it would be more palatable to Christian listeners if I would use the word reasoning or reason or deduction or best inference. If I somehow changed my vocabulary, it's possible that it would cut down on confusion. But I really think that in some cases we're so far apart that we're going to have to do this work anyway of trying to exercise what the other person means and what we mean ourselves, and to do the hard work of understanding each other. So while I think there's some just criticism to say, well, they're just using this word science and it's being used very loosely, or at least I was using it loosely. I actually think you used it more carefully than I did. But to clear the air, I am talking about a specific kind of reasoning, and the kind of reasoning that has done what you said, Matthew. It has given us men and women in outer space. It has given us mobile phones. It has allowed us to peek into our genealogy and into the deep past. It has told us more about the beginning of the universe than we knew 2,000 years ago, and it tells us something about the universe unfolding in the future. It is the best tool to date for understanding who we are, where we came from, and where we're going. And if there is a competing set of tools that does better than that, I'm open to them, with the understanding that I think we all use truth in a pretty common and pretty well understood uniform way.
Naturalism anyway, that the only way that a argument, like a logical argument that's formally valid, can get you the complete truth of something is if you're analyzing natural things.
Yeah.
But
okay, this is really interesting here, and I think this slips by, but there's an admission here that is potentially problematic. He talked about an argument in the form which I would accept, because it's an argument that has at its base true premises. Incidentally, true because we know them, because thank you, scientific method. So on top of that, we've built an argument based on those truths and come to a conclusion that is also true. Thank you, scientific method. And apparently that only works for naturalism. So the Christians which have used this kind of formula at us to try to convince us of a God, maybe they're not quite so good at things that are not natural. Maybe this formula of argument doesn't quite work for things that are not natural. Is that what he's saying here? That if this argument has been used for something that is supernatural, don't rely on it because it might not be reliable? Is that what he's saying?
It feels very much like that, doesn't it? I had a similar thought in the run-up. So you've made a claim. Let's say there's a claim that a God created the universe. What benefit do you derive from saying that you can't access this God with the scientific method? Well, as far as I can tell, the only benefit you derive from saying, oh, well, my God can't be accessed through the scientific method is an argument that can't be disproven.
Yeah.
That's backed up by the idea that, well, only science gives us information about natural things. And if you're dealing with supernatural things, or whatever you want to call it, no matter what you're defining, you can never demonstrate it. So it's back to...
Yeah, and also we have this
thing,
question.
you know?
Actually, Darren Plies says this here, but then arguments against arguments are not evident. So, like,
Yes,
right.
That's right.
You beat me to it.
Sorry. Is Gingy a wog or not? It's an counter argument I raised a little while ago. You have to have a way to test your conclusion. So if you're just making two arguments, one is an affirmative argument, the other is the perfect contrary to the affirmative argument, which conclusion is true? Arguments against arguments don't work. It is only our perceived familiarity with a subject that allows us to think that we're right. But I can forward the evil God hypothesis, and Braxton can forward the good God hypothesis. And the reason we haven't gotten anywhere on this for thousands of years now, and Christians, by the way, I think would say that the Islamic God, Allah, is a form of the evil God hypothesis, right? But the reason that they compete on the world stage for followers is because, as far as I can tell, neither one of them are particularly to be privileged over the other.
Yeah. And this is why I like to skip over the arguments and go straight for the evidence. Right. The argument is a pretty wrapper around the bar of chocolate. Let's take off the wrapper, throw it in the bin, and go straight for the meat inside, the juicy bit, the evidence. Yep. Convince me with the evidence. Arguments will convince me of the thing that I am more comfortable with, but it might not be the true thing. The evidence will convince me of what is the true thing, whether I like it or not. That's why I'm not a Christian anymore. Evidence dragged me out. Arguments delayed that process.
Indeed.
They are presenting reasons.
Yeah.
Philosophical, even if it's not framed as an argument, a philosophical argument, they are presenting a philosophical explanation of why this doesn't work.
Yeah,
right?
but then they have to prove
why
that,
philosophical
which
reasoning.
gets back to, then they have to demonstrate that,
Yeah.
which gets back to the question begging about science.
Right.
So.
Is my take. And again, I want to say, I think these guys are super nice, and I think they're smart guys. I'm just trying to point out what I see as problematic.
And
here.
it's self-defeating because they can't demonstrate it by their own standard. But
what about every science experiment ever done? Okay, we're super smart. Not only are we nice, Andrew, we're super smart.
Right. And so apparently they're supernaturally smart because they think they've taken us down here. Look, why do I think science works? Because every car manufacturer on the planet uses the same kind of test to give us gas mileage. I don't see that in any area outside of science. Technology, engineering, and math, the scientific method. Okay, just so that I'm clear.
Yeah, everything in our world that works for us is thanks to the scientific method, because when things fail a test, they get rejected and they try again. That is why cars are safer to drive. Cars get better gas mileage.
What did God do? This non-physical, non-temporal God. What did he do, and how did he do it to save you from that car wreck in front of you? You see, if you can't answer how, I defy you to prove that he did.
Yeah, I think the how is important, but then the how gets to touching the physical world, and I think that's possibly where some of the objection that's coming up here is, and that everything that we're saying at some point touches the physical world. But then that's the same with Christians as well. When Christians claim that there was a healing, that's God touching the physical world. When Christians say that God helps them through the low times in their life, that's God touching their physical being, whether it's with the chemicals in the brain or whether it's just their outward expression of their self. it's still all touching something that's physical. So this objection that the scientific method only touches the physical doesn't really get out the problem that claims of God's existence and God being real in your life also, to some degree, touches the physical. So I think the objection works for both, and so helps them not.
Yeah, I agree. Fine, your God's not physical. Your God still does things, or at least you claim that your God does things. Whether you call it the scientific method or transcendental truth, you have to be able to somehow assess to a high degree of certainty that the agent and the action are connected. You don't have to call that science. You can object to the word science. You can object to science, technology, engineering, math. You can object to all of that. But what then convinces you? This is, I think, the heart of the difference between us, Matthew. I don't mean between you and me. I mean between you and me and Braxton as co-hosts. If your God does something, how do you show me that he does something?
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking.
If you could prove it,
Yeah.
that also is self-defeating.
Right.
If you can prove it by your own.
Right.
So it's self-defeating
Right.
either way you go.
Now, it could be that this mugger fugger, be careful how you say that, is correct. And I mean, maybe this is one of the guys from the podcast, for all I know. I did tag them in the Twitter thing, but I don't know that it is. But they say, you're right. Nobody's saying science is the only way to knowledge. It works because if it is continued reliability.
Yes, but their claim was about arguments, about
Right.
using deductive arguments and logic. Their claim was you can't ever get to the whole truth unless you're dealing with the natural world.
I encourage you, the listeners, both our regular, still unbelievable listeners, and if you're from Braxton's show, I ask you to do this one thing. If you don't read research that is coming up in this show, if you just listen to what Braxton and his co-host have to say, and as we play on, if you don't do anything else beyond this one request, I ask you, I implore you to go look up what a deductive argument is, and then look up what truth and validity are in relation to deductive arguments. Because I didn't only give my assessment of deductive arguments at the beginning of this show and throughout it, quite frankly. Deductive arguments do have two components. They have to be well formed, but deductive arguments have two essential components that I just beg you to go look up for yourself. And that is that they have to be well formed. The conclusion has to necessarily proceed from the two or more premises in the argument. And the conclusion has to lead to a fact. Logicians call it truth and validity. And at one point during this show, you get the impression that Braxton and his co-host are arguing against this. Now, later on, they come back to this, and I think they do some needed rehabilitation. But right now, they're arguing that you can have conclusions that are not testable. And you can think I'm wrong. But the people that do this for a living have good reason to tell you, independently of me, that an argument has to lead to a true conclusion, something that you can test and understand. And if it doesn't, to quote Matthew, the argument's not evidence.
There's several things I want to do. Let me just get some business things out of the way first. So the user that is being quoted just here is a YouTube user account by the name of Muggerfugger. And as Braxton said, Just be slightly careful about how you pronounce that. But thank you, Muggerfugger. You made a really good point, exactly the point that I would have made. And I'm glad that you got what I was trying to say. Thank you. So to repeat the comment in its full, you're right. Nobody's saying science is the only way to knowledge. It works because of its continued reliability. Other methodologies vary in efficacy. There is no presupposition. And that's the case. Every science experiment ever done continues to confirm and affirm the scientific method. Other ways of trying to get to the same knowledge don't match it for its efficacy. If we're going to get something, let's try and beat what the scientific method gives us. Right, now on to the point. I never said, suggested or implied that a deductive argument was not a valid way of getting to the truth. What I said was what apologists bring to the table is arguments, not evidence. I didn't say anything about the validity of arguments. I just said in relation to a question on evidence, what apologists bring is not evidence, it's arguments. And moving on from that, what apologists often bring in terms of arguments for God are not deductive arguments. So again, there's a miss here. So what we've got is we've gone from the question, what do apologists bring that I count as evidence, to I'm saying that deductive arguments are not a valid way of getting to the truth. Those are not the same thing. We need to be careful when responding to what people are saying, especially what people, the positive arguments that people are saying, what I'm saying on this show. Please don't reinterpret that to mean something else that I'm not saying, because that's just what's happened here.
It's a very good point. And we are going to talk less about deductive arguments as we go forward in the conversation. There are going to be inductive arguments and possibly some abductive arguments. And this show was heavily front-loaded about deductive reasoning. There are some language barriers here and some misunderstandings about claims.
Well, and so, that statement has to be underwritten by something, yeah, which leads us to everything we just said.
Right, and so back to Josh Rasmussen, and he's using a bridge, and what his point is we can actually go out much further with this bridge as we build it. It can get us much further than you think it can. So, for example, using arguments and reason and these sorts of things, we can just from us thinking here, I would say we can get to something that we can know about the whole universe. And that is, if we accept the law of non-contradiction, which is pretty solid, then we can know that there are no two-dimensional square circles anywhere in the universe.
Right.
No married bachelors anywhere in the universe. And we don't know that because we traveled the whole universe and looked everywhere and didn't find any, the evidence, right? We got there rationally, thinking about things, building on that bridge to get there.
Well, yeah.
I think this is a poor example here because he's using as his run-up into this things that are definitionally not compatible. That's how we know them, because they're defined to be not compatible. We don't need to go looking for them anywhere. I don't even need to go looking for them on my desk. I can tell by reading the definition that they're not compatible. So there's a bit of a misdirection being played here.
There is. I'm not denying that we can use reason to discover things about the whole universe without having to go and look under every rock. I solidly affirm that. What I am asking is whether you can use reason to conclude something about a transcendental, non-physical, non-temporal place that you claim exists because it's in your head. And how do you differentiate it from any non-physical, non-temporal, transcendental space that you think is in somebody else's head? Now, as to married bachelors, they are under the impression that this is some kind of non-physical, transcendental truth. It's not. Let me tell you why. Marriage is a contract. Contracts are real enforceable things in our real enforceable universe, even if it is common law marriage, where people have lived together for a certain amount of time and therefore they're married and they have to split up their marital estate when they divorce or whatever. These are rules that we derive from the physical world. Yes, there are no married bachelors, not by definition because the definition says something about the world. No. But because a contract between two people that has them married is the kind of contract that tells us something about the relationship between two people. So if you are single, if you're not part of a marital contract, it tells us something about your physical relationship to someone else. Square circles. Why can I say that there are no square circles? Well, here's why. And it doesn't have to do with transcendental truth. We can draw this on a piece of paper. And I could say to you, dear listener, that there are square circles. And you would say, oh, no, let me show you, Andrew. Let me sit down with my protractor and my pencil. I'll put my little pencil in this protractor and we'll draw this circle. And then I'll use my ruler. I'll draw these straight lines. And I can demonstrate to you that the definition of circle and the definition of square are physically incompatible. This is not a transcendental truth. Now, maybe they do have transcendental truths. I'm waiting for one, but so far, we haven't reached a truth that we cannot test.
Mm-hmm. I would like to pick up, though, on the point that Braxton was saying is that we don't have to search the entire universe to know that certain things that we're confident about are true. He just picked a duff example because he picked an example that's definitional, not an example that we know through science. So let's pick something through science. You know, the physics, the laws of physics. This is a conversation that I've had with somebody I know. How do we know that the physics, the other end of the universe, is the same as the physics in our part of the universe? You know, we don't know. But do we assume that to be the case? Well, pretty much. Yes, we certainly assume that to be the case as far as the visible universe, because everywhere that we measure physics, and we know how physics works because it's interaction between atoms at one level, and the way atoms interact with each other is dependent on the atomic mass of each of those atoms and the makeup of the molecules that those atoms form, and that changes how they interact. You get two hydrogen and an oxygen together and you get a water molecule, and that is wherever it is. And the reason why that's what happens is because of the way hydrogen and the oxygen join together. Physics dictates how they join together. We're quite reasonable in suggesting that you put those same two atoms on anywhere else in the universe and they're going to behave the same way because it's physics. And everywhere we've looked, it's the same. We've seen nothing that suggests that we should think otherwise. So we're quite reasonable in concluding that beyond the visible universe, that physics will behave the same. We don't know with absolute certainty. I don't think anybody says that we know with absolute certainty, but it is absolutely a reasonable conclusion to make.
And it goes further. So I've recommended a book a couple of times in the past, Eliezer Yudkowsky's book, From AI to Zombies. He also runs, the whole book is available at the website lesswrong.com. Eliezer points out something that I had not thought about before. There's a sort of multiplication of laws beyond the invisibility boundary that must take place if we think the laws somewhere in the universe that we can't see have changed. So here's how he worked this out. He said, imagine that we have constructed a starship, and that starship travels pretty close to the speed of light. Okay, and we shoot it off in some direction out into the cosmos. At some point, that starship will go far enough that we can no longer communicate with it. It will eventually become invisible. This is what universal expansion is doing, right? There are things in the universe that we can't see, because one of the oddities of the speed of light is that there are galaxies that are so far away that their light can't get to us, or at least we think there are. Now, getting back to the starship. So you shoot this thing out into space. And at some moment in the future, it travels across the invisibility boundary so that it can no longer communicate with us and we can no longer communicate with it. Right? Now, what is most reasonable to believe? That at the moment it crosses that boundary, it's called the horizon problem, if any of you want to actually look it up. There's a horizon problem in astronomy and cosmology. This starship crosses that boundary and it is forever barred from communication with us or us with it from then on. The moment it crosses that boundary, do we think it ceases to exist? Well, we would have to invent another special law that said anytime something crossed that horizon so that we could no longer communicate with it and it could no longer communicate with us, we would have to invent another set of laws that said that now something else is happening to it, that it is now different just because we can't get to it. Why do we think that the universe is the same all around? Well, because if it's not, at least to some extent, we're having to conjecture about laws that we just think might exist, that we can't say for sure exists, but once we can't see it, something else happens.
Mm-hmm.
We should not conclude, because there are things we can't see, that they operate by different laws. Maybe they do, but we are just positing laws that we don't know anything about.
Yep.
I mean, but that goes back to definitions, which, like I said, they acknowledge that, but it doesn't serve their case at all, one way or the other.
Right. Well, what I'm saying is I'm just showing that an argument can actually get you to a reliable conclusion about things.
Yeah.
And so we can know something about the whole universe.
And that
so
has
that
nothing
alone
to do with
shoots
has
down.
nothing to do with the natural world either.
That's right.
It has strictly to do with the way that we define words.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. The whole universe is the natural world, and words are defined by humans who are part of the natural world. But beyond that, it's got nothing whatsoever to do with the natural world.
I feel like their exchange has so badly misrepresented my view that I'm being strawmanned. I really don't think that's what they're trying to do.
I don't think they're intentionally strawmanning us, but it does feel like we've been strawmanned. So somewhere along the line, there's been a misunderstanding of our intent, and I'm confused by it.
Yeah, me too.
I also quibble with this suggestion of linking definitions to the non-physical world, because definitions only exist because physical humans with physical brains created the definitions to describe the physical world in which they live.
Let's say you've got in your head a picture of heaven. You can perfectly well lay that out. You know, it's got walls that are this high, and it's got these dimensions between the walls, and the walls look a particular way, and it's got transparent streets of gold. Didn't make that one up, not my fault, not responsible for it. You can have these definitions, but if someone else has a different definition, why are you right and they're wrong? I don't see any way to talk about a transcendental place, try to talk about heaven without using physical terms. You can't use time, you can't use space, you can't use energy, mass, you can't use color. It is a non-physical, non-temporal place outside of the universe. Now, talk about it. I'll wait.
You can't wait. That's a temporal expression.
Oh, okay. I won't wait. You can go ahead and press play. Very well done.
Bachelor, by definition, can't be married.
Mm-hmm. Well, stick with the square circle.
Or square circle.
Mm-hmm.
No matter how you slice it, you're not dealing with the natural world that way. And
we're dealing with transcendental things.
Right.
There's that word. You did warn that was coming up. And we're back. Andrew and Matthew had to have a bit of a break there. We've actually paused for about a week between the last session and this one. If you notice anything in my voice, unfortunately my voice is beginning to fail. We'll see how we get through on this. I don't want to push it too much, but we're going to carry on anyway with the next few bits of the video about 14 minutes so far into Braxton's video. We're heading up into a bit where they actually play out some of our previous podcast episodes. So obviously we're not going to be playing that back through. I'll edit that.
And so we can know something about the whole universe.
And that
so
has
that
nothing
alone
to do with that has nothing to do with the natural world either.
That's right.
It has strictly to do with the way that we define words.
Well, it's not just how we define words.
It's not how we define mammal. I'm just saying it's bachelor by definition can't be married.
Mm-hmm. Well, stick with the square circle.
Or square circle. Mm-hmm. No matter how you slice it, you're not dealing with the natural world that way. And
we're dealing with transcendental things.
Right. Or abstract objects.
Abstract objects.
And so, yes, you can get to the whole truth, which undermines their entire premise.
About some things.
Because you have to have, the only way you can get to the complete truth about something through a argument is if you're dealing with elements of the natural world.
Right. So they mentioned the word there, Andrew, that you were getting excited about the transcendental thing. But I don't understand the point about undermining our whole premise because you can't get to truth via an argument, if I've understood what's been said. But that was our point as well anyway, wasn't it? That an argument doesn't get you to the whole truth.
It was. And even if I granted for a moment that there was some kind of an abstract notion, as far as I'm aware, a bachelor is something that's in our universe, not out of it. Marriage is something that's in our universe, not out of it. Squares and circles are things that are in our universe, not out of it. And even if we talk about the notion of a square rather abstractly, that notion of a square is something that we came up with as a rather abstract representation of shapes that we see in our universe. So when we look at a cube head on one face, what do we see? Well, we see a square. We actually teach children to draw certain objects like dogs and cats and that sort of thing, using basic shapes that we see, triangular ears, oval eyes, that sort of thing. And so I don't think that even when I'm being as charitable as I can be, I don't think that their argument stands particularly well. And I'm not sure that I understand it, but the best I can do with it is when you define a word, when you create a usage for a word like a bachelor. Well, a bachelor defines a relationship that someone doesn't have.
I'm much less interested in this whole bit about definitional descriptions because it's a bit of a tangent from the point that we were making in our original response to this question anyway.
It is.
So I struggle to see the relevance. So, I'm prepared to fully agree that, if you define things to be contradictory, then the things that are met by that definition are going to be contradictory. I don't have a problem with that, but I don't see how that either agrees with or addresses any objection to the points that we were making, because I don't see the relationship.
I don't either. And just one more moment on the word transcendental. I think that both Jonathan and Braxton would say that some things that we know about God are transcendental. So that the common usage of the word transcendental has to do with something immaterial or spiritual. And I've occasionally mentioned a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. I think it was December 21st or 22nd of 2009. Volume 109, number 51, if I remember correctly. And I think it'd be useful, if you don't mind, to read this article. And what it has to do with is individual notions of God, right? So if you thought there were a God and I thought there were a God, what would we expect to see? Well, one of the things that we would expect to see is an ability for us to disagree with our God. And we've actually studied this. So when I think about you, Matthew Taylor, when I think about you, I am pretty good at recognizing that I have opinions that are different from yours, right? And you do the same. You're pretty aware that you have opinions and views that are different from mine. One of the interesting things that this study shows is that the same thing is not true for people's conceptions of God. What we've discovered is that independent of whether a God exists or not, our thoughts about God are just our thoughts. So if you don't mind reading those few paragraphs, I think this is at the heart of what they're claiming about transcendental truth.
For the benefit of the listeners, the link to this paper will be in the show notes, and the paper is titled Believers' Estimates of God's Beliefs Are More Egocentric Than Estimates of Other People's Beliefs. This is what Andrew was just talking about. Correlational, experimental, and neuroimaging methodologies all suggest that religious believers are particularly likely to use their own beliefs as a guide when reasoning about God's beliefs, compared to when reasoning about other people's beliefs. People's estimates of God's beliefs were strongly correlated with their own beliefs than were estimates of a broad range of other people's beliefs. Manipulating people's own beliefs similarly affected their estimates of God's beliefs more than it affected estimates of other people's beliefs, demonstrating that estimates of God's beliefs are causally influenced, at least in part, by one's own beliefs. Finally, neuroimaging evidence demonstrated that reasoning about God's beliefs tends to activate some regions that are active when reasoning about one's own beliefs, indeed statistically indistinguishable in the whole brain analysis, whereas reasoning about the average American's beliefs activates relatively distinct regions associated with reasoning about other people. We believe these findings provide important insights into the origins and variability of religious beliefs and have interesting implications for their own impact on everyday judgment, decision-making, and behavior. First, these data join a growing body of literature demonstrating that religious beliefs are guided by the same basic or natural mechanisms that guide social cognition more generally. Religious beliefs need not be explained by any unique psychological mechanisms, but instead are likely to be the natural outcome of existing mechanisms that enable people to reason about other social agents more generally. Insights into the basic mechanisms that guide social cognition and therefore likely to be of considerable value for understanding religious experience and belief. Second, these data provide insight into the sources of people's own religious beliefs. Although people obviously acquire religious beliefs from a variety of external sources, from parents to broader cultural influences, these data suggest that the self may serve as an all-important source of religious beliefs as well. Not only are believers likely to acquire the beliefs and theology of others around them, but may also seek out believers and theologies that share their own personal beliefs. If people seek out religious communities that match their own personal views on major social, moral, and political issues, then the information coming from religious sources is likely to further validate and strengthen their own personal convictions and values. Religious belief has generally been treated as a process of socialization whereby people's personal beliefs about God come to reflect what they learn from those around them. But these data suggest that the inverse causal process may be important as well. People's personal beliefs may guide their own religious beliefs and the religious communities they seek to be part of. Finally, these data have interesting implications for the impact of religious thought on judgment and decision-making. People may use religious agents as a moral compass, forming impressions and making decisions based on what they presume God as the ultimate moral authority would believe or want. The central feature of a compass, however, is that it points north, no matter what direction the person is facing. This research suggests that, unlike an actual compass, Inferences about God's beliefs may instead point people further in whatever direction they are already facing. That's really interesting. I've heard this kind of thing mentioned and proposed by people on various forums, the Unbelievable Facebook page being a good example. But I've never actually seen it come out in an actual study, and this adds weight to the kind of language that I've seen a lot of atheists use about the relationship between religious belief and people's own personal preferences.
One of the things that I found most striking, about this particular paper is that it covered correlational, experimental, and brain imaging results, which leads me to think that the degree of credibility here is quite high. So
Yeah.
We've heard the question before about why there are so many different Christian denominations. We've asked this question on this show. There are thousands by conservative estimate, tens of thousands by more liberal estimate, Christian denominations around the world. If there's one God, the question has been asked, why so much variation among what Christian believers believe? Well, one possible answer to that is, well, fine, God does have an individual view, but it's us humans getting it wrong. This data flies in the face of that.
Mm-hmm.
As far as we can tell, there is no external data that we access about what a God might want. What we have access to is our internal landscape, our own judgments. And so whether there is something transcendental outside this universe, I can't say. But what I can say is that within this universe, we are all simply using our internal landscape. You can claim God all you want. This isn't the only study of its kind. I dug this one up because I think we can all wrap our heads around the idea of a compass that always points north no matter which way you face, right? We can all understand that. It was reasonably well written. When we talk about transcendental truth, as far as I can tell, whether it's a perfect circle or a claim about God's love or whatever, this is something just going on in each person's head. And I think this is going to come back up later in this show as we go on. There are claims made, and over, I come back to, we differ because we're all human, not because some of us are Christians and some of us are atheists, and because God is talking to some of us and not talking to others.
Which, I mean, you can't go look around and find a circle in the natural world. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's so I wanted to say that, and
or a number or anything.
And what the only reason I want to point this out is just as a antithesis to the claim. So we find it self-defeating ultimately, and we have given an example of at least one or two places where we think this happens, right? Where you can get to the truth.
Now, what they would say is, but what your a pushback could be, but what you're saying is that kind of truth that you're talking about is a convention.
No, it's not.
Well, we decided that
things can't contradict.
Well, not that, but but we decided the whole idea about bachelors, for example.
I know.
Or
forget bachelors
circles.
for a second.
Or circles.
We didn't make up circularity, and we didn't make up.
No, I agree
with
you, but it goes back to what words you're using and concepts. They could push back and say you're just talking about conventions at that point, though.
But I didn't make up squareness. I didn't make up circularity, and the fact that those two things can't both be true of something at the same time, is also not something we made up.
I just want to point out there are things that we discover, and there are things that we invent, and in some sense, I guess I agree that we didn't make up circularity. But there are plenty of things that we observe that we didn't make up. We didn't make up gravity. We didn't make up fire. We didn't make up water. These are observations. And what math gave us in regard to a circle is that a circle is an object whose distance from its center is the same all the way around. I'm not quite sure what they're on about here, and I wonder if you are sure. I wonder if you've gleaned a different point than I have.
I don't really get the point of this section that's focusing on contradiction, because they've arrived at it through things that humans have defined that are contradictory, therefore they can't be the same. You can't have a square circle or a married bachelor. Yeah, okay, fine. I'm not seeing how that fits to what we said about arguments not being evidence, because those are also two things that are not the same.
Right.
So they're saying other things that, when you match it up, kind of agrees with the point that I made right at the very beginning in the answer to this question. So I'm not really sure what the point is. I think what they're trying to say about the contradiction thing is they think there's a contradiction in what we're saying, but as we said in some of the points that they've made previously, they're not being entirely accurate in their representation of what we said. There's been some assumptions and some leaps made which have arrived at conclusions that are not what we're saying. And I think what they're doing is they're addressing those misunderstandings of what we said and what the point that we're trying to make. But still, on the subject of apparent contradictions, I've got two ideas which you and the listeners might be intrigued by that are real and happen in nature, that might be seen as contradictory, but that we see and we witness them in nature. The first one is because I mentioned it earlier on in our discussion as well, is a molecule of water. Molecule of water is made out of two different types of atom, both of which are from a gas that is highly flammable.
It certainly is.
And if you get those two gases in isolation and put a flame to them, it's quite spectacular. But you join them together to make a molecule of water, and not only do you get something that's not a gas, so you've mixed two gas together and got something that's not a gas. How does that work? But then only is the result something that's not flammable, it actually puts out a flame. So how does that work? So there's one, potentially something that qualifies as a contradiction in nature. And then the other one will be the very, very famous light slit experiment, where you've got a single particle of light going through two slits at the same time. How does that work? Because one thing cannot be in two places, yet this particle of light from the evidence goes through both slits simultaneously. That surely cannot be possible, yet experimentally that is exactly what it looks like happens.
I think that's right. Just as a slight aside, for those listeners who would like to verify for themselves, we've all heard that, water it's H2O, right? It's 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. If you don't know for yourself that that's the case, I'll give you a quick way to verify it. Take a 9-volt battery, plug a battery harness onto the top of it with 2 wires. Those 2 wires will be a positive charge and a negative charge. Get a glass of water and stick the leads into the water. What you will see is that bubbles are formed off of both sides of that battery, off of each terminal. And some bubbles, the bubbles on one side are larger than the bubbles on the other side. Here's another interesting experiment. Take a bowl, turn it upside down, put it above the water, allow one side of the bubbles to escape out of the bowl, the other side of the bubbles to be trapped underneath, and light a barbecue lighter, something that's got a little bit of an arm to it, and you actually get a flash. You actually get a pop. The gas explodes. It combusts. And so you can actually verify for yourself right now. You can just hit pause, and you can go see that water is made up of these two things that Matthew's talking about, and that separately they're quite volatile, put them together, and you get water. A little brief science aside. And sometimes I just want people to not have to trust the thing we say, right? I want people to realize that the things that we say, we're not just parroting back because we read some book somewhere, right? I want people to recognize that we do some of these things for ourselves, and we're not just parents. I don't know why it came up this particular moment, but I want people to become acquainted with the world around them. And here's one fun thing to do where you get kind of interesting results.
All right, so
Back to the apologetics.
Yeah, what experiment can we do to prove 2 + 2 = 4? Right. Okay, I'm going to get back.
2 + 2 divided by 2 equals 2.
Menstruating person of color says, that's the username, okay? It's me, the world's most famous gender fluid Orthodox Christian. Happy Halloween. Here's your treat for Halloween.
That's a new handle from
transgendered person of color, maybe, or something like that.
I can't remember what it was, but it's always funny.
I don't remember. But anyway, thank you for the super chat. Now, so one of the things that happens with what they've just said, when you understand that scientific, natural science is not the only way to get there, is you understand that your how you define evidence is going to be a little different. For example, we've played 2 or 3 times on this program the illustration that Joe Schmid gave on.
Let me just pause there, because I've gone and zipped through or cut out the bit from our episode Braxton has just listened to, because like I said, I don't want the infinite wormhole effect going on here. Mm-hmm. But basically what I've done is I've just made the explanation that in response to claims that there is a God, my response is to ask the question, what evidence is there available, or what experiment can I do to validate the claim that you've made? Because I want to be able to confirm it. I want to be able to fact check your claim. So Braxton is going to respond to that. And he made earlier the comment about what experiment can you do to show that 2 + 2 = 4. But that's not really a very good response to that question, because there are many ways which you can show that 2 units + 2 units equals another unit of 4. But also remember that the numbers 2 and 4 are human constructs. They are numbers that we've created to represent a known specific quantity. So again, this is completely something that's a human construct. So humans have defined these numbers, and then these numbers go into a formula which comes up with a specific result. This is nothing at all like trying to claim that a supernatural God exists, and I need an experiment to show it. So if you notice what Braxton's done here, he's equivocated. I've said in response to the claim there is a God, I want the experiment that confirms that. And Braxton has gone, well, how do you show 2 + 2 = 4 experimentally? He hasn't answered my question. He's equivocated to something else to distract.
He has, and it's a catastrophe of an equivocation. So integer properties have been studied. The associative property of addition and the commutative property of addition cannot work unless 2 + 2 = 4. And you might even ask, how do we know about multiplication and division being functional opposites of each other? You can try that. 2 × 5 is 10. Divided by 5 is 2, or divided by 2 is 5. You can actually do this. And this is how we teach our children to do math. If we want them to understand that 2 + 2 is 4, we just hand them 2 apples and say, I have 2 apples. And now when I give you my 2 apples, you have 4. The fact that we can take the units off and manipulate numbers more abstractly doesn't then say that we can't experiment with these abstract notions. We can. But I would contend that number grouping, real number properties of integers, et cetera, so ad infinitum, why do we think they work? Because it works in the real world.
At this point, Andrew and I agreed that my voice was failing too much and we should stop and finish off the discussion at a later date. Thanks for listening this far. The second part of this response will be available next week.